very much, and good evening, all of you. I'm not used to all this heat in the room, coming from Canada at minus 25 yesterday, and there's just about 2 meters of snow in front of the house, where I noticed crocuses out here, so I'm quite happy to be with you. And thank you for inviting not only myself, but my team from the Child Soldier, Romeo Dallaire Child Soldier Initiative, particularly Dr. Whitman, who will participate with me in the presentation we have on the perspective of how this new weapon system is not only out there and being used, but in fact how we are attempting to treat it, to reduce it, and ultimately one day to eliminate it. This phenomenon in which we find ourselves in is due to the fact that we've stumbled into a new era. It is not like before. We have moved in the post-Cold War era into an era that is not temporary, but seems to be a continuum of enormously complex and enormously ambiguous conflicts around the world. And these conflicts are not interstate, but intrastate, and because of that have added a complexity to which we are not historically been very adept at. And so imagine the Cold Warriors of the Eurocentric world that we were involved in, having served in southern Germany, northern Norway for over 30 years, to all of a sudden find ourselves in the early 90s amidst a whole series of imploding nations, failing states, civil wars that lead to extremes that are not only ethnic cleansing, mass atrocities, but even we see the resurgence of something that we had thought never again to happen, and that is genocide. That era in which we have now taken stock of, or attempting to take stock of, over the last 25 years, has proven to be so difficult is that we have not wrested the initiative from those who are, in fact, wanting to perpetrate conflict and, in fact, destabilize for a variety of reasons, be they ethnic, be they tribal, be they religious, or be they simply power sharing. Which brings me to where I started with this whole program, was with the Rwandan genocide. It was a genocide in which one ethnic group, a majority ethnic group, had decided that ultimately, in order to not have to share power, to maintain power, to not find themselves having to negotiate with a minority to which they had a certain reticence in regards to its abilities, they decided deliberately to simply eliminate them. And so they put into action a plan to ultimately slaughter 1.2 million people. And implemented it. Implemented it in front of us. Implemented it even though we were warning that we were going into catastrophic failure. We could not move the international community to realize that this actually was going to be of a scale unheard of, and a scale that ultimately would be a horrible black mark on all of humanity as we ebbed the 20th century. They implemented it, and we stood by. We stood by, and by doing that, we sort of acquiesced to the fact that this thing can happen. And it can happen because it's not necessarily affecting us directly. It's not necessarily affecting our self-interest. Why would we engage into a tribal war in sub-Saharan Africa? As some indicated, it's in their genes. Why would we want to risk the lives of our own in such a very difficult situation? We'll let it run its course. And then, in a couple of weeks, we'll come in and then we'll provide the necessary resources to assist in stabilizing the situation and go through the processes of development and reconstituting and reconciliation, and hopefully it won't happen again. This is after spending billions in that country previous. We let that degenerate to the extent where ultimately, yes, several 100,000 human beings were slaughtered in just 100 days. The question that remains is that as we watch this, was that sort of the premise that we've used throughout in looking at massive abuses of human rights and, in fact, conflicts in the era in which we stumbled into? And lo and behold, it wasn't. For at the same time, as there were more people killed, injured, internally displaced, refugee than raped in the 100 days in Rwanda, we poured 67,000 troops into ex-Yugoslavia. I couldn't keep 450 in Rwanda. The international community was not prepared to have blue beret casualties, even though it was watching about 10,000 Rwandans slaughtered a day. And that's a deliberate decision. Some would say, well, really, we're not involved, but not deciding in a situation of that nature is a decision. And so the international community wrote off the Rwandans that were slaughtered, and ultimately, the subtitle of my first book, The Failure of Humanity in Rwanda, was not just the failure of Rwandans losing their sense of humanity by slaughtering each other, of which 90% of the population was Christian. But the rest of humanity had abandoned the Rwandans. At the time, 191 other countries abandoned the Rwandans and used a usual phrase that came up more and more often in the 90s, well, the UN has failed again. Where in fact, the international community and the nations that had the capability of responding are the ones who should be held accountable for the failure of the UN to be able to respond, because we refuse to give the UN everything from political support for a mandate, to the troops, to the equipment, to the priority, and even to the humanitarian assistance. The international community and every sovereign state refused to respond to the call from the UN, and as such, permitted that to happen. This entry into the subject is brought about because the bulk of the slaughter that happened, the bulk of the forces that faced each other, government and rebel, were made up of youths. They were not professional armies of long-standing veterans. There were some. But the bulk of the fighting troops were child soldiers, were youths, 15, 16, 17. And the bulk of the slaughter in every church, in every mission in Rwanda was conducted by youths who had been recruited into a political wing, a youth political wing of a political party that slowly, over the period of about a year, indoctrinated them and changed them and refocused them into a militia that had deliberate objectives of being anti and other ethnicity. And it's them, with machetes, that conducted the slaughter. And so, not only the facing of child soldiers with an AK-47 up a nostril and at a checkpoint was a factor, but it was the use by adults of massive numbers of young people, to do their dirty work, to do the killing, to become the primary weapon system of a conflict that caught me off guard, caught us all off guard. For we had no experience in it. We were Eurocentric. There was a couple million of us here serving on this side. There was a couple million on the other side. We had our sort of nuclear umbrella, and it was functioning according to the rules of international humanitarian law, law of armed conflict, conventions that we knew would be applied. That's what we've been doing. The culmination of the Westphalia concept of where frictions degenerate to conflict between states and war. But this was a whole different exercise. This was actually introducing a new weapon system that had in it a moral and ethical and legal dilemma as we faced it, in attempting to respond to mandates that did not give us the ability to intervene. Chapter 6, to observe and report, while Chapter 7 would have given us the authority to use force, to structure a mission to use force, but we would have still required in Chapter 7 at that time the authority to protect civilians. 3 weeks into the genocide, I was still arguing with the Secretariat as to whether or not I was allowed to protect the over 20, nearly 30,000 Rwandans that we were protecting. That it was simply not in our mandate. Well, by then there was no mandate. It was just slaughter and abandonment. And so, the child soldier situation remained with me, traumatized how I saw conflict. And as such, when I was released from the forces medically, I got involved in child protection, war-affected children, and then pursued a desire to figure out how, in this era, do we eliminate, do we eradicate this weapon system, this new weapon system that's been brought in to the inventory in a scale that's off the chart. We are speaking in the hundreds of thousands of children being used as the primary system in these conflicts. And so, if we have a new weapon system, should the effort and should our desire be to neutralize it, to potentially eliminate this weapon system, to make it ineffective, so that conflicts in these civil wars and these imploding nations not engage children in a whole spectrum of employment as primary instruments of that conflict. Should we not try to find the solution to that? And what we were discovering, and what I was pursuing in my discovery, as I was in Sierra Leone in the early 2001 during that civil war, and then subsequently into Darfur and monitoring other missions, is the fact that we were very, very engaged in trying to sort out the problem after. That is to say, how do we eliminate the impact on the children of having been used as child soldiers? How do we not only demobilize them, but how will we reintegrate them, rehabilitate them? How will we take and pick up the pieces afterwards? And over the last 25 years, we've been doing that and spending massive amounts of money on that side, but it hasn't reduced the numbers. It hasn't reduced the effectiveness. On the contrary, that weapon system continues to grow and to be used ever more extremely. So, decide I did to go after the front end of the problem. That is to say, how do you prevent them from being recruited in the first place? And secondly, How do you neutralize them? How do you make them ineffective once people want to use them? How do they become a liability to those adults that are using them? And if we can do that, we can then potentially take out of the equation of this very complex and ambiguous era of these very difficult missions to understand and the objectives of many of these conflicts to be resolved, we can take away a major problematic, which is the use of children. There still is the other one that's very in evidence, rape. Rape being the other weapon of this era. Deliberate. Not a few rogue soldiers on the sidelines, but deliberate rape sites to mutilate, to destroy the social fabric, to create horror, and through horror instill fear. And once you instill fear in the population, then you can move the population to your own advantage. As the extremists did in Rwanda, on mutilating and raping in the tens of thousands, and moving close to 4 million people as a negotiation base for potentially whatever maybe subsequent peace agreement might come about. So they're there. And the conflicts are ongoing, they're prevalent in numbers, and they seem to be a weapon of choice. And so how do we counter that? How do we reduce that threat? And that really is what we're getting at. Child soldiers are not a social economic problem, a child protection problem only. They are first and foremost a security problem. They are a threat to the ability of missions to achieve success and to stabilize nations before, hopefully, they go into catastrophic failure, or at least to reduce their availability to permit that to happen. And so, the Child Soldier Initiative, based out of Dalhousie University, with Dr. Whitman, who will take over from me in a few moments, who was the executive director, was brought about to work at ultimately the eradication of the use of child soldiers. And the ultimate aim is not just to say, well, it's against the law. Yes, it is. It's a crime against humanity to recruit child soldiers, and the International Criminal Court is on a steep learning curve of actually making that effective and fighting that impunity. It's not only to stop that usage and to go after that dimension of it, but it is to prevent it from actually being used. For the business in which I felt to be engaged in was not conflict resolution, was not post-conflict reconciliation. And by the by, effective post-conflict reconciliation is, of course, a very useful and important aspect of conflict prevention the next time. It's sort of, you don't close down the shop for inventory and then start from scratch. We've got history that is, sometimes we go back as 500 years. In Canada, we went back not long ago, not celebrate, but didn't even commemorate a battle that happened 250 years ago between the British and the French on the Plains of Abraham. And so we sort of changed loyalties, but it was so sensitive an event that no political involvement was nurtured by any of the politicians of our country. We didn't even recognize the date to commemorate those who had died and fought on that day. It was just too sensitive. One side having lost, the other side having won, and neither side really wanting to acquiesce to the fact that what we had become. So, with that, prevention, absolute prevention, is the aim of the exercise, and not conflict resolution, but prevention. And so, that's why, in our work, we are looking at research in regards to what are the tools out there that we need to stop the use of children. How can we prevent them from being recruited in the first place? Training of security forces so that they know and recognize what this threat is and be able to respond to it in a whole different format than being surprised and all of a sudden facing a threat that they are not used to, and in fact find themselves in some very serious dilemmas of trying to respond to. How many children can you kill in accomplishing your mission to protect others without it affecting you? Is that the solution? Do we stop the use of child soldiers by essentially treating them purely as another combatant? And thirdly, the third dimension, the advocacy side of our work, which is a dimension of getting the senior leaderships within the world community to respond to the fact that there's something fundamentally immoral about a conflict based on the use of children. We don't want nuclear war, we don't want biological war. We've been fiddling recently with chemicals. Imagine we're using children, we're using the peers of your children as primary instruments of war, and that does not call upon the international community to respond. It's just not strong enough. And so, ladies and gentlemen, with that as a sort of start point, the question was, those child soldiers, what do they do? Who are they? And well, we get at them and make them ineffective. And so there's been a lot of work done in the international community on the paperwork, on the legal side, with the Optional Protocol on Child Rights that came out in 2000, of course, making it a crime against humanity with the International Criminal Court. We've got an SRSG who's on child protection, who's working hard at trying to get countries to stop recruiting child soldiers in their own government forces, let alone the non-state actors. So, and there's reports every year, and shaming and naming, and all that's been going on. There's been all the rehabilitation and reintegration and the worry of re-recruitment that is also going on, where we've been spending a lot of money. That's out there. But the question is, however, have we gotten to the root of the problematic in order to prevent it from being effective? And so the definitions that have come out are significant, because this is not the 9-year-old boy with an AK-47 only. That sort of image is not the vast majority of child soldiers. First of all, 40% of them are girls. I could demobilize 10 boys for every girl in Sierra Leone in 2001, because the girls fill the full spectrum of employment. It is a sophisticated weapon system, from the front of all the killing and maiming all the way through to the bivouac and the logistics in many of these male-dominated societies, and on top of that being used as sex slaves and bushwives. I mean, you can't find a more end-to-end system than that. And so a child soldier is anyone under 18 used in all those employments, in either a military force, government, or a non-state actor. And as such, it's not purely a situation of how do we military tactically do a left flanking on a platoon of child soldiers. It is how do you eliminate a force that's using throughout it child soldiers. And so there, in itself, required us to take a look at that employment and to face the fact that not responding to it was failing in our missions of security. We had to meet that dilemma. We had to meet that ethical and moral dilemma. we had to meet it without finding ourselves with the only option is of destroying these children. For the destruction of the children, we're causing casualties amongst our own. And not responding to them, in fact, being influenced by the scenario of, well, they're children and maybe we don't want to engage, was giving more room, more power to those who were actually using them. Because we were backing off. We were holding back. We've been taking casualties with child soldiers. This is a recent scenario of South African forces in the Central African Republic where they were ambushed by opposing forces. They took casualties. I believe in the end 11 of their soldiers were killed and a series of others injured. But not only did they take casualties, they realized at the end of the firefight that they were actually fighting children. And this created a horrendous problematic political inside of South Africa. Do you send soldiers into situations like this? Do we participate in that? And what tools are they using? Are they trained to do this? And if they're not trained, then why are we putting them in front of this threat? And what training do they require? And how do we actually prepare them for them? Well, that near traditional, if we can use 20-odd years, because really we started to use these child soldiers massively in the Mozambique conflict in the end of the 80s, and when all those weapons became available, but also this idea of the demographics of using children came into being. But not only are we facing this scenario of this sort of traditional youth, either in a government force with whatever level of training that force in mostly developed countries have, or non-state actors and how they're using them. Not only are we facing them in the sort of their classic conflicts, which include, as I said earlier on, genocide, but we're also now finding them in an escalating scenario. We're now finding them into an arena that is playing by none of the rules at all. And this has introduced that ambiguity, that complexity. These guys are playing by none of the rules. We are held accountable to those rules. Humanitarian law, law of armed conflict, the international conventions, human rights, no torture. I mean, we're held accountable by our societies, and not only that, morally, we have been educated to be held accountable. We feel that accountability. It's part of our values. Yet, the other side, contrary to when we had the Cold War, when we knew their ethos, we knew what to expect, this side, this scenario, they have the initiative, and they are pushing inhumanity to limits that are defying our imagination. Now, some of us have gone through the traumas of seeing barbaric actions in the past. This is getting a lot of publicity because it's one of the extraordinary tools of the communications revolution now to be able to give it that. But it's being used so effectively that is, in fact, destabilizing how we can respond to it. And the most horrific side of that is the fact that they're using children, 9, 10 years old, in the front lines. They're educating them in the madras, in the schools, preparing what? Preparing the next relay, preparing the long term. They're in it for the long haul. They're preparing recruits for continuing the conflict. It's not a one-shot deal. They have built in that indoctrination process an ability to continue to forcibly recruit, take away, abduct, indoctrinate, and use and abuse massively young people, young children, to do the horrific scenarios of this conflict. And so, how do we handle that extreme side? It's already complex enough to go after non-state actors in Central African Republic, in Mali. We've seen the complexity already with Nigeria and Boko Haram and how they're handling that. We've seen Al-Shabaab on the eastern coast. We've seen them in Somalia. We've seen child piracy. Nearly 50% of the pirates are youths. Well, you stop pirates not only at sea, we're investing hundreds of millions of bucks with our ships out there. You got to stop them on land. That's where they're recruited. That's where they're used. And so this, however, has moved it to another scale. How will we crack this one? How will we be able to prevent that recruitment? How will we be able to neutralize that without destroying it? As we are now dropping 500-pound bombs from our aircraft, yours and ours, in our country, on targets where they are. And so we needed not only to face the problem, we needed how do we actually approach the problem and bring in these new solutions. And this is why, and I don't want to belabor the point too much, except to indicate to you that we are looking at means of preparing the security forces to be effective in facing these threats, neutralizing them, and participatory in preventing their recruitment by making them more able and agile to work with the non-military disciplines that are deployed in the field. Humanitarian, development, let alone the police and the military working together. And so, through these methodologies, we are attempting to bring forward a new doctrinal framework to militaries and police in order to equip them in order to be able to handle this threat that continues to grow. And it continues to grow because of its use. And its use is, in fact, being recognized by the extremists who are pushing it, as I said earlier on, to the limits. And so, from armed groups to opportunities that they're bringing forward, to the fact that, in the interesting study that we've been looking at, is the fact that if adults are prepared to recruit children to conduct these horrible exactions, we have been deducing that this could be, in fact, an early warning that those adults, those people, are prepared to go to enormous extremes in the accomplishment of their mission. Meaning that recruitment of child soldiers could be an early warning to mass atrocities and ultimately even to genocide. And just that recognition in Central African Republic, years and years ago, 5, 6 years ago, we were seeing recruitment of child soldiers. And all of a sudden it explodes and everybody is sort of surprised. The child soldiers used are putting the children in those societies at risk because they become suspects just by the fact that they're children and that they potentially can be turned into military. The effectiveness that can be used by the children can be effective. We can influence that level of their engagement, and we find ways. The post-traumatic stress, not only on our soldiers who are facing them and using lethal force, but also them, the children. What about that child soldier leader who's 14 going on 25, who's been leading 25, 30 kids for the last 3 or 4 years and has developed all this leadership experience? How do you demobilize them and rehabilitate them and send them back to learn Dick and Jane with other kids? How do you prevent that individual from leading a banditry group and then ultimately even possibly another revolution and so on. And of course, the efforts of trying to bring resolution into a conflict zone by continuously destabilizing it by the use of children. Now, we didn't sort of pull this out of the air in regards to how to go and tackle it, where to go tackle it. The listing here is a listing of countries that are at risk identified by the global study and the global group on the responsibility to protect, which is that new doctrine that came in 2005 that everybody's afraid to use. And so these are countries that are seen at risk. These are the countries that are actually recruiting them in their forces still, and that the SRSG is trying to stop. There's a correlation right there between actually using them in their forces and countries that are at risk of, in fact, implosion and continued catastrophic failure. So, why pursue this ultimately? And what do we do with those child soldiers in the field? I'd like, if I may, with your indulgence, I'd like to ask Dr. Whitman now to bring on a second dimension to our presentation, and I'll come for a few concluding remarks.